And this is the key price ratio. The price of the corn, remember, is not a tradable, and if it inflates, it's going to put upward pressure on wages and erode profits. If the price of textiles goes up, great, producers of textiles love it. So what happens to it? Well, compared to what? Well, compared to England. England is it's the workshop of the world. How's England doing? Well, that black line describes steady decline, lots of volatility, steady decline in the relative price of textiles. But they keep introducing new technologies to keep their grip on this industry. They have to, given this immense decline. Mexico's not undergoing the same decline. It's the skinnier line, lots of instability, but at least from the 1870s, that's pretty flat. It goes up a little bit at one point, but it's compared to Britain, Mexico's doing pretty well in terms of that indicator, the ratio of those two prices. And here's the same story for the own wage, which we know is really critical in driving employment conditions in industry. And lots of instability, but Mexico is now that solid line, just to keep you awake. Switch the solid lines. But Mexico's that solid line, not much happening until very end in that period. So the own wage is very stable, indicating that they're much more capable of competing with foreign competition. So domestic supply side conditions matter a lot. Okay, so that was Mexico is just one example of one of the third world countries that does undergo deindustrialization because of globalization and the industrial lead that Western Europe takes. But it's not as severe a deindustrialization as everywhere else around the poor periphery. Okay, so then comes the reversal. So bad news for industry in the third world all the way up to the 1870s, and then the world turns. Globalization has kind of done its thing. In fact, there's now a rise in protection. There's backlash starting to happen all around the globe. It's happening in Europe, and it's certainly happening with every poor country that gets autarky. Latin America, as you'll see in a moment, is one of the most protected countries, is the most protected region in the world when they get their independence. So is it that? But we do know there's a turnaround. Also note that this turnaround, this catching up, I'm not speaking about GDP per capita. I'm just talking about industrialization performance. Most of the literature out there written by famous economists over the past 20 years have focused on aggregates like GDP and GDP per capita. And I'd rather not. I'd rather look at one industry and one sector in detail, industry, because that's one we think is a carrier of growth. So I'm going to focus on that. All of these guys, these famous guys, Paul Krugman up through Lucas, Nobel laureates in there and all the rest, these guys all believe, which all of us believed all along, why didn't we get the Nobel Prize? And that is that urban areas and industry are carriers of growth for various reasons. All these externalities and agglomeration economies and all that stuff. They are carriers of growth. Maybe today it's less industry and more high-tech services, but the same argument applies. So much so that it's standard now in so-called modern endogenous growth theory. This kind of thinking. Well, okay, very good reason then to focus on industrialization performance rather than just GDP per capita. Okay, So I'm going to be looking with you at industrial output, constant price, of course, over those 4 periods. They're each about 2 decades long. The first, the start, being 1870 to 90, and then that period up to World War I, then the interwar period, and then finally the ISI period, where there was very active anti-global and protectionist movements afoot in most of the world, including the Philippines. Okay, so you got those episodes, and we're going to compare the performance of output growth or of productivity performance compared to the leaders. So we will be talking about catch-up all the time. So every number you're going to be seeing now is relative to those 3 leaders, and the 3 leaders being UK, US, and Germany. Okay? All right. The sample is not bad. There are 29. You can document these for the interwar period. There are 12 of these are from the European periphery. That is the poor parts, the lagging, backward Eastern Europe, Southern Europe, and Southeastern Europe. And there are some examples from that, Russia being, of course, one of the biggest of the bunch. Latin America, we have 7 observation for Latin America. Don't do too well for Africa, sad to say, but we got those 3 anyway from the Middle East and South Africa. 7 from China, including the Philippines. The sample, of course, gets thinner as we go back in time, because it's harder and harder to document countries as you go back and back in time. So for the interwar period, you got 29. The Philippines is there. For 1890 to 1913, prior to World War I, Philippines is still there. Although it can't really document it very well from 1890. You have to start documenting from the early censuses in 1902, 1903. And for that period, you only have 13 observations, and the Philippines are gone. You just can't document performance at that time. But still, you can document Philippine performance relative to their competition around the poor world. How is the Philippines doing and catching up on the leaders compared to everybody else? And you can answer those questions starting for all across the 20th century, which isn't bad. Okay. Didn't I say that already? Okay. So here's what you get. Now this is just the output growth, and I guess you really have to squeeze your eyeballs. Well, you have the handout in front of you, right? You don't have to squeeze your eyeballs. You don't have a handout in front of you. You do. Okay. All right. I don't. So I have to squeeze my eye. So there, for example, is a European periphery. And you'll note that in the early period, it's falling behind, negative number. That is, they're not growing, industry is not growing as fast as the leaders. So they're falling behind, okay? The next period, that period up to World War I, the number is about 0. Just barely holding on, holding their own during that episode. So things are improving a little bit. But the big jump for the European periphery is the interwar, where they start catching up 1% a year. That's not bad. And then, of course, you get into the post-war period, and that increases by a factor of 4. And it's not just Russia doing its thing during the first 2 5-year plans and then post-war development. All of them are doing it. All the European periphery some are having even faster growth rates than Russia. Okay, so plenty of evidence there in the European periphery of slow getting started, and then by the interwar, bingo, they start undergoing a very significant catch-up, and that continues into the ISI period. Important point, therefore, don't just look at the period 1950 to 1975, the classic import substitution industrialization period as the start of industrialization in the third world. I'm sorry, it didn't start there, it started in the interwar. Big time. And for some, even earlier, as you'll see in a moment. Where am I now? Okay, for example, the leader of the pack is Latin America. It already starts at the end of the 19th century with extraordinarily rapid catch-up. Catching up on the UK, US, and Germany. The US and Germany are undergoing unbelievably rapid industrialization. The US is leaping over England to become the dominant industrial power in the world by 1890. And in spite of that performance, look what Latin America's doing. It's growing faster.